right, guys, so we're on chapter 3. It's called The Recognition. The learning target is going to be the same for now. Read for what is directly said and what can be inferred. And the essential questions are what recognitions happen and don't happen in this chapter? What do these recognitions or lack of recognitions teach us about Hester, Chillingworth, and Dimmesdale? So I've divided it up. The first section is called the first recognition. And the context is that Hester's on the scaffold in the marketplace, serving her sentence of being publicly shamed for committing adultery. And as you're reading, I want you to highlight what you learn about the white man clad in a strange disarray of civilized and savage costume, how he reacts to seeing Hester, and how she reacts to seeing him. I am going to go ahead in this video lesson and let you know, in case you're not already aware, that the white man clad in a strange disarray of civilized and savage costume is in fact her husband. So when you annotate in the margins, when he's introduced, make sure you write down Hester's husband. And then I want you to jot down some clues that help us to know that it's him. So if you're thinking back at the end of chapter 2, how he was described in that chapter, well, I guess let's start with slightly deformed. Okay, so like over here, I'd put like the fact that he's slightly deformed. It said that in chapter 2 right at the very end, and now it says it right at the start of chapter 3. So that's like one of your hints. It says at the end of chapter 2 that he's thin, and so saying it again is a hint. And then the two other ones that aren't quite as obvious, in chapter 2 it talks about him being well-read and a scholar, and here it's talking about remarkable intelligence, so you could make that connection as well. And then in chapter 2 it talks about how it says his sight has a penetrating power, and here it says basically the same thing. His look became keen and penetrative. Okay, so there's lots and lots of hints that the man that she was referring to at the end of chapter 2 is the same man who showed up here. And based on his reaction of seeing her, like how he reacts when he sees her, look at this. His face darkened with some powerful emotion. It talks about, the sentence before, a writhing horror twisted itself across his features like a snake gliding swiftly over them. His face darkened with some powerful emotion. Those are your hints, right? That like a normal like stranger to town wouldn't feel so strongly about Hester being up on the scaffold for adultery, right? Then like when she saw him, right, she pressed the infant to her bosom, that it actually hurt the baby, like so hard that it hurt the baby, and she didn't even seem to hear it cry, right? This is basically the first recognition that Hester and Chillingworth see each other. In the second section, I still want you to read it. Please go through and read it. I'm just trying to help you and hopefully make you see things that maybe you might have missed. But please, please, please read it. The context for the second, or it's called the first recognition continued because it's still about Chillingworth and Hester seeing each other. So the context is that Chillingworth, Hester's husband, plays dumb and asks a person in the crowd questions to get information about her. And in this section, I want you to highlight examples of irony. So I'll help you a little bit with that now. I also want you to note down why Chillingworth has been delayed, like why it's taken him like 2 years to get here. And in case you kind of miss it, he was actually held captive by Native Americans. And in fact, it's very likely that the Native American that's with him is probably bringing him to town for some sort of a ransom. All right. It's also interesting that Hawthorne, he wants to give you this like background information, but instead of doing it just in like paragraphs as like narrative, he decides to give you the information through dialogue. And so he has Chillingworth play dumb, asking questions of a townsperson to try to like fill Chillingworth in, but also try to fill the reader in, if that makes sense, on what's been happening. Um, so um, in this right hand margin, I also want you to annotate where you see why those in power have been merciful to Hester. Why did they give her such a light sentence? I want you to show me like where that is and that you understand. I want you to tell me what Chillingworth is determined to figure out and write it down right by where it says it. And then let me help you out with some irony. So one interesting piece of irony is that the townsperson starts telling Chillingworth about Hester's husband. And so it's ironic because he doesn't know that he's telling Hester's husband about Hester's husband, right? Like, so that's one piece. And then later, sorry, I'm just going to flip my sheet over so I go to the page that I'm on the screen. Okay, so then later, towards the end, it says that Hester has a fixed gaze on Chillingworth at moments of intense absorption, like she can't take her eyes off of him, right? Everything else seems to vanish, leaving only him and her. That's what it feels like. She said, or it says, such an interview perhaps would have been more terrible than even to meet him as she now did, with the hot midday sun burning down upon her face. Sorry, I went a little bit too high up. Here we go. She was conscious of a shelter in the presence of these 1,000 witnesses. It was better to stand thus with so many betwixt him and her than to greet him face to face, they two alone. She fled for refuge, as it were, to the public exposure. That's ironic, right? That in this crowd of people who are shaming her, she feels safety, right? She fled for refuge, as it were, to the public exposure. You would think it would be the opposite. You would seek refuge from the public exposure, not to it. But to her, it's better that she has all these people between them, and it's not just she and her husband alone. And she dreads the moment when the protection of the crowd it will be withdrawn from her. So that's ironic, okay, that she finds refuge and safety in the crowd that's shaming her. Okay, in this next section, this is leading up to the second recognition. So the context is Mr. Wilson, he's the clergyman, the person in charge. He's trying to get Hester to confess who the father is, and he asks Arthur Dimmesdale to help since Dimmesdale is Hester's reverend. So in this section, I want you to highlight how Hawthorne describes Dimmesdale. And then over here, I want you to write down some words and phrases that describe Dimmesdale. Hopefully not like just all like copied over from here, like you have some inference as well. And I want you to also note down similarities and or differences that you see between Dimmesdale and Hester. One of the things I noticed that I thought was kind of interesting is pay attention to how many times Hawthorne describes Dimmesdale as young. That really stood out to me because he describes Hester as young a couple times for sure in chapter 2. And so I mean, repeatedly, he describes Dimmesdale as young, and that's significant to me because we know that Chillingworth is old. So by being like Dimmesdale's like her age, or probably a little older, but it's like emphasizing the fact that there's not a significant age gap between Dimmesdale and Hester, like there is with Chillingworth, who is wrinkly and old, and Hester, who's I don't know, no older than 20, I wouldn't think. So, all right. I'm gonna let you do that one on your own. I think you're fine. You won't necessarily miss anything I don't think you'll miss anything that I want you to get. Um, and then the next part, this is the second recognition. So the context is Dimmesdale standing on a balcony over the scaffold. He leans over the balcony and talks directly to Hester. He's kind of up on a balcony with like the clergymen and the people who kind of decide her punishment. And then, anyway, so he leans over and he's like kind of face to face with her, is what I imagine. So read with purpose says highlight evidence that Dimmesdale both does and does not want Hester to confess who the father is. So both. You might want to do them in different colors if that's helpful. And I also want you to highlight how the baby responds to Dimmesdale because that's significant. And then just over in the margins, just make sure it's really clear whether you have to label it, that this is evidence that Dimmesdale doesn't want Hester to confess. Like, for example, when he starts talking to her, he says, if thou feelest it to be for thy soul's peace, and that thy earthly punishment will thereby be made more effectual to salvation. Okay, so there's this if, right? Like, if it's for your soul's, like, if it'll give your soul peace, if you feel like your earthly punishment, will be made more effectual to salvation. It's not like just do it, it's like an if, right? So, and then later on, it says that he now drew back with a long respiration. He's like, right, like a sense of relief. And then what evidence is there that Dimmesdale does, whoops, I read it the wrong way, that Dimmesdale wants Hester to confess? I mean, if you look all in here, he says, like, don't be silent from any mistaken pity and tenderness for him. Though he were to step down from a high place and stand there beside thee on thy pedestal of shame, it's better than to hide a guilty heart through life. It says, like, he does, why add hypocrisy to sin? Like, he doesn't want to be a hypocrite, right? And it's like, here's the opportunity, like, that has been granted to me. And he says, to go ahead and say it because perhaps the person doesn't have courage to grasp it himself. And so there are lots and lots of hints in here that Dimmesdale's the father. Yeah. And just how he talks, and how he's described up here as being so nervous and lost and kind of just broken and scared and pale and everything. So, the second recognition, I really want you to notice how the baby responds to him, right? Not necessarily that she's like, you're my dad, but the fact that she's like drawn to him. And so there you go. And then lastly, the refusal to recognize. So the context is that Dimmesdale has just told Hester that she can name him as the father. And then reading with purpose, highlight examples of Hester being strong, in love, loyal, and protective. So kind of right in here, so she looks deep, looking into the deep and troubled eyes of the younger clergyman. She says, would that I might endure his agony as well as mine. Like, I can't take his suffering too, right? His agony too. Like, to me, that shows that she's in love with him, right? That she can't bear to see his suffering as well as her own. The fact that she, I want you to find, like, label where it shows she's loyal, where it shows she's protective, and then where it shows that she's strong. And you can find a couple strength ones, at least one up here and at least one or two down here. So at the end, just please make sure that you complete the essential questions. I'm not looking for a ton of writing, but enough just to prove that you understand. And then the self-assessment, how well do you feel like you can answer those essential questions? And just highlight one. And then the learning target, how well do you feel like you can read for what is directly said? And how well do you feel like you can make inferences, like just those two together? If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, again, please read it. It's so good. and it will help your reading. It'll help you become a better reader, right? And don't just listen, like actually follow along, because just listening won't do anything for your reading ability. So let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy.